We're going to finish our sixth session, actually. We've been doing over several months on the early Renaissance in Italy, especially in central Italy, around the area of Florence. Although today we're going to turn our attention a little bit to northern Italy and go to Venice, because it was in Venice that we first begin to see Italians painting with oil paint. And we think of oil paint as a very venerable, old master technology that's been around for centuries. But we have to remember that in the 1400s, during the early Renaissance, oil paint was the new technology. And many people didn't really understand how the technique worked, because it was so different than the other techniques that had gone before it, and gave artists the ability to really create a very, very believable world, not only using perspective and light and shade, but now with the introduction of oil paint with its luminous, jewel-like colors that are all the result of glazing, oil glazing techniques. Now, oil paint had actually been around for centuries. And it was used in Italy, that is pigments dissolved or in linseed oil. And this paint had been used when an artist needed a flexible medium, because tempera is very crisp and tempera will crack. But oil paint is more flexible. So if you had something, for example, a beautiful saddle that you want to decorate with flowers or designs, it would be linseed oil-based paint that would have been done. So they knew that was around. What was new is the new technique of oil paint, that instead of just painting all at once, which we call alla prima, instead it was painted step by step in a series of layers. And it was really invented, this new technique, not oil, but the technique of transparent glazing was invented by Jan van Eyck. And he was from the Netherlands. At that time it was Flanders, he was Flemish. And he is the first one to use oil painting. We can see in a painting like this, which is a portrait of an Italian banker, Giovanni Arnolfini, and it turns out his wife. We always knew it was a double portrait, but there were some details that until the 1930s we weren't sure of. And it was during the 1930s that German art historian Panofsky, who was a master at iconography, looked very, very carefully, especially at the little convex mirror that's in the background of this Van Eyck painting. And he noticed that reflected in the mirror are not only Giovanni and his wife, but also two other people that are in the doorway. And if we blow it way, way up, we can see that it's clearly two people. And the idea is it was actually a priest and Van Eyck, who was the witness. So this is actually a wedding. It's not just a portrait, but a wedding. Now, the detail level of this is incredible, because this entire mirror, I mean, with the frame and everything, is smaller than the size of a quarter in the original. The original's in London at the National Gallery. And so when you get and you look at the tiniest details, he must have used a magnifying glass. For example, in here, and these are really, really tiny, are little vignettes of Christ's crucifixion and his condemnation. And here I think he's being crowned with thorns and so forth, and eventually is buried, is laid to rest, and then resurrects and so forth. So it's a whole series of meditations on Jesus's death and resurrection that are minuscule. And he even does the little reflection on the glass and the frame. Or look at these beads, and the way the beads refract the light. It's really incredible. And what Panofsky pointed out was up here, it says Johannes van Eyck witnessed this, saw this, 1436 or 39, I'm not sure which, in the 30s. And so really, it's literally, he's the witness at a wedding. And there's all sorts of symbolism in there. The wooden shoes is very Dutch, that he takes off because he's on holy ground, because, marriage is a sacrament. And a little dog, Fido, represents fidelity. And there's all sorts of little things like the three oranges on the windowsill that are the symbol of the Medici family, and show this Italian merchant's connections back to Italy. What I want to point out, though, is despite the incredible surface reality of this painting, there is no linear perspective, because perspective was a trade secret of the Italians. The Italians had perspective, and Van Eyck knew that things got smaller, appeared smaller as they got farther away, but he didn't have the system to work with. So what we find is, in the early Renaissance, we find that the Flemish have the trade secret of oil paint and how to use it to create these effects of verisimilitude. And the Italians had the secret of perspective. And it wasn't really until the very end of the early Renaissance and the beginning of the High Renaissance that that the Italians began to incorporate these new ideas from the North. Now then, not too much longer later, Dürer, the German artist visiting Italy, brought back a perspective to the North. So there was a cross-fertilization that happens in the High Renaissance. But this is still a beautiful painting. There's even one candle in this beautifully constructed, I mean, just look at the detail of this brass lamp. And one candle is burning, and that represents the presence of God. The one candle represents the presence of God, and because it is a sacrament. Remember, they're still Catholics. There's no Protestants yet, so they're good Catholics. And you may think that I'm probably going on too long about this, but it almost looks like it could be a shotgun wedding, because it looks, my students are always saying, is she pregnant? But actually, it is a reference to pregnancy. She's not pregnant. She just sort of gathers up that very heavy cloth of her dress in a way that suggests pregnancy. And what that is a wish for fertility, that this couple will have a lot of very healthy children and so forth. And so that's a part of the symbolism that goes on there. I, by the way, copied this. I was trained originally as an artist, so I bring a different background to my study of art history than most art historians do. And so these techniques, I taught a class that painting with the old masters at one point. There was a very interesting exhibition at the Met a few years ago of unfinished paintings, and this is one that's in their collection, and it's not by Van Eyck, but it's by a Flemish painter from that century. And what it was originally a wedding picture or something like that, and then by x-raying they had found out that there was actually Madonna and Child underneath. And when they removed the overpainting that had been done a century later, they found that they also had to remove the oil paint, but they got back to the original drawing, which is actually a pen and ink drawing with all sorts of elaborate cross-hatching and so forth. So it's an interesting thing. There's also an unfinished Dürer that's in the collection of the Met. The next time you're in Met, take a look at that. And he likewise has, it looks like a pencil or a silver point, a detailed underdrawing. This is Van Eyck's, we think it's a self-portrait. It's very small, it's in the National Gallery. It's hardly bigger than the picture that you see on your screen right now. That is, it's a postcard size, a little bit bigger than that. And the frame itself is interesting because it gives a date, and then it says in Flemish, Johannes van Eyck made this as best as I can. And we think that it was a showpiece that he would have out in his showroom when you came to his studio to perhaps commission him to do a portrait or an altarpiece or whatever it is you might have in mind. He had some little samples out there, as all the artists did, to show the level of craftsmanship. And this is a very high level of craftsmanship, because here we're zooming in, and these are very, very, very tiny. But you can see even little tiny razor stubble from the razor, and even a little bit of red bloodshot in the eyes. And this is the whole face is no bigger than an egg. and it's incredible. I want to point out also the frame is very clever because it looks as if, oops, it looks as if it's carved in these words, don't they? And then gold leaf, that some of it has kind of flaked off. But the truth of the matter is there's no gold leaf on the frame. The frame is entirely painted out of yellows and browns and so forth, and there's not even any carving, and that's all painted. So he's doing a top oil. He's doing a fool your eye kind of a thing. Can you pick out what parts are painted and what parts are actually three-dimensional? So it's a marvelous little demonstration piece that, who coming into the studio of the famous Jan van Eyck would not fail to be moved by a painting like this. And of course, there were magnifying glasses, so you could examine them with that. Next time you go to the Met, bring a magnifying glass with you. You can, as long as you don't get too close to the paintings, you can use it. Now, the first Italian to use an oil paint was Antonello da Messina, and he died very young, and we don't have many examples of his work, but he seems to, we don't know too much about him. We know that he came from Sicily, so he's not from the center of the art world that kind of revolves around Rome and Florence and Venice, but he first appears in northern Italy, and in Venice, and he somehow, this is an oil painting, a portrait, not a self-portrait, but again, if we blow it up, and this one is not as cracked as the Van Eyck, it also is a little bigger than the Van Eyck, but you can see the same level of, microscopic. Check out, for example, the reflected light on this side of the nostril, just next to the shadow. There's a little reflected light that gives it this wonderful roundness. And this is just itsy bitsy teeny tiny. So these guys are, technically, it's really, really incredible. Every hair, on the eyebrows, every individual eyelash. It is just absolutely stunning. And we don't know how we learned this. Perhaps it's been speculated, and this is probably true. He probably traveled to Flanders and did some work and maybe did some apprenticeship there, but he seems to sort of appear with these fully developed glazed things like this. Now, if we compare it to Alessandro Botticelli, who was the golden boy, the star of Lorenzo de' Medici's circle in Florence. But Botticelli used the traditional medium of egg tempera. And egg tempera, the binder is not linseed oil like oil paint, but is egg yolk, and it dries very, very fast, and it has a very dry kind of quality to it. And so there's no time to blend colors, because as soon as you put them down, within a minute, it's dry. So you have to use what's called a dry brush technique, where you have a brush that is a little, that has a certain level of firmness to it. It could either be a hog bristle brush or I remember that, I forget the type of hair, but it's not as soft as sable and not as hard as hog bristle. And what it does is, when you get the paint, it's almost like drawing with chalk. You sort of drag the dry brush across the surface. And so to blend, you have to make many, many tiny little strokes, one on top of each other, to blend it together. And if we get a little close up here, we can see a little bit of this to a certain extent in the Botticelli. He's very skilled at it. But you notice, for example, that there's a more linear quality. For example, the way the nostrils are outlined, the way the eyes are outlined, the lips, even the chin. Look at the definitive dark line that separates the chin from the neck. Over here, there's no such thing. In fact, these hard lines are all sort of slightly blurred, as if it's in soft focus. We don't see any clear line down here at all. We see just this beautiful shadow that just blends off into darkness. Here's a little reflected light on the bottom of his pudgy little double chin, just a slight thing to give it that roundness. It is absolutely incredible. And that linear quality that the Botticelli has is a result of the dry brush technique, because it's almost like a pencil. It has a dry quality. And also in oil paint, because you're doing layers and layers and layers, you get very, very rich, deep darks. If you compare, for example, the hair in the oil painting by Messina and the Botticelli portrait, they have the same cap. It must have been a popular style at the time, but I think you can see the difference here going on. Messina doesn't have that many finished pieces because he died very young. We don't know that much about his life, but he does seem to have influence, especially in Venice, which is the first place to kind of pick up oil painting. This painting of St. Jerome in his study is, or Augustine in his study, I forget, one of those old church fathers from early Christianity. And here he shows him studying in his study. But also this stone that surrounds, it looks so real, is not real at all. That's all part of the painting. And so he kind of does a little fool your eye of a painting within a painting, sort of. And here this peacock in this little dish of water just sit on this ledge and cast shadows, almost as if you could pet the peacock or take a sip from the water. And he's very consciously playing with these kinds of beautiful illusions, and they just really stunned everybody. It's not a very big painting, but once again, like the Flemish people that he's looking at, the level of detail. He must have used a magnifying glass to get these little, figures on horses and little tiny castles in the background and the hills and so forth. Or if we go over to the other side, we have the lion, which is the symbol of the saint, and then another landscape, all done, of course, in perfect perspective. And he's showing off his, his ability to use perspective, because you can really feel that you could walk into these spaces and measure the spaces, because you can look at the tiles on the floor and count them. And so it's all this very mathematical sort of representation. So he follows the Flemish in their technical use, but at the same time he's retaining, the trade secrets of the Italians. Here, this little peacock, which may also be a reference to the Medici family, who had bankrolled so much of the Renaissance, especially in Florence. And the only place, I suppose, in the Western Hemisphere where you could find peacocks, which he had imported from China and which strode around his garden. Another painting, also perhaps unfinished, especially when we look at the veil, and perhaps the darker tones had not yet been laid in when the painting was abandoned. He does also a very daring sort of foreshortening by having that hand, the right hand of Mary, come out at us in that way, very convincingly. And that's very difficult to do convincingly. And it's an annunciation. That is, the angel appears to Mary and asks her permission for her to be the mother of Jesus. And of course she says, I'm not married and I never slept with a man. And the angel says that if she gives the permission, the child will be of God. And that's how the story in Luke goes. And it's shown with Mary and the angel Gabriel approaching her. But in this one, we are Gabriel, and we sort of approach the Virgin. And she, a little startled, maybe a little taken aback, puts her hands out a little defensively at us, like, wait, whoa, how I'm used to seeing angels appear in my bedroom while I'm reading my Bible, and it is an incredible level of the glazing that you can see here. Although again, it doesn't have that level of finish that we had seen in the early ones. But here again, that beautiful reflected light on the nostril, he just does it so beautifully. Here is an unfinished painting by Antonello de Messina. And here we can see that parts of it are more finished than others. And we get this kind of glimpse into this underpainting done in browns and yellows And then after that, the other colors are glazed on top of that underpainting. So it's underpainting and overpainting. And here you can see some parts of the angels are also unfinished. And it's great because we can really get a window into, you know, what this artist, what his technique were, or what his techniques were like. And so these unfinished things can be very fascinating. Well, Bellini, Jacopo Bellini, and it's really his son, Giovanni, that we're looking at, but it's a whole family of painters that goes back generations. And Papa Bellini is really Jacopo, and he's a decent painter, not extraordinary, really. And this little Tempra painting of Madonna and Child with the Donor. This is the person in a tiny miniature sort of way who paid for the painting and who's represented there as seeking the intercession of Mary and Jesus looks down and blesses him. It's not an extraordinary painting, but it's certainly very competent. And one of the interesting things about Papa Bellini is we have a whole bunch of his drawings, because these artists had drawing books that their apprentices would copy from. And for the most part, they've disappeared. But with Papa Bellini, we have a whole bunch of those, and you might want to investigate that at some point, because we get an idea also of the teaching in the workshop. Because, you know, as I mentioned before in our lectures here on the early Renaissance, it's not like modern day, where an artist like Picasso or Jackson Pollock or Norman Rockwell does a painting all by themselves in their studio. And this was not done. During the Renaissance, it was always a group effort. There were always a team of apprentices and journeymen and assistants that lived in and worked, so that people from the Renaissance, some of the most productive of the artists, you just wonder, how could they possibly have made that many hundreds of finished paintings? And the truth of the matter is that they had a whole army of assistants. It was done under their direction. And one way, one teacher told it to me, and I thought this was an interesting way, it's like a master chef who has under him a number of different cooks and just sips a little bit of the sauce, for example, and says, oh, it needs more oregano, or whatever. That sort of master chef working with already skilled cooks. It's kind of like that. So anyway, Bellini was a great teacher. He also has a couple sons, not only Giovanni, but also Gentile Bellini. And this is one of his most famous, a very large painting in tempera of the procession of the relics of Saint Mark. And Saint Mark was one of the gospel writers. I guess he was a disciple of Saint Peter. And this in the background is the son Marco, because the city of Venice is dedicated to Saint Mark. And so this is the beautiful Byzantine medieval cathedral that's there. And here is a procession with the relics, the bones of the martyred saint, that are brought kind of on parade here around the piazza to the adoring adoration of the people. The Italians are really wonderful at these pageants. One of the things I've been going to for several years, and I won't be able to this year, but Florence on Three Kings Day and the Feast of the Epiphany, they have people dressed up as Renaissance people that ride across the bridge and wind their way through the town with trumpeters and people juggling, and it's this incredible sense of theatricality that the Italians do so well. And of course, you know, opera is the kind of ultimate art form for this sort of performative aspect of Italian culture. And unfortunately, there won't be any parade of the Three Kings this year. But they wind their way through the town, and then they put their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh in front of the little creche, the little stable with its little statues that sits in front of the Duomo, the Cathedral of Florence. Anyway, back to Venice. Gentile Bellini, this is one of his biggest things. He also went to Turkey and worked for a while for the Sultan of Turkey, and this is a little watercolor he does of a scribe. And you can see the Arabic on the right. He doesn't stay there forever, but he does become kind of the court painter to the Sultan or the Caliph for a while. Now, Giovanni Bellini is more important, and I think than his brother Gentile is, and that's because he really represents the transition from the early Renaissance to the High Renaissance. He dies in 1510 or something like that, so he dies only 10 years into the new century. But you know, the Sistine Chapel was begun a few years earlier than that. So he does live to see some of the fruits of his own adoption of oil paint. So this is an early one, and it's done in tempera, and it very much looks like he's has a nickname. All these Italians have nicknames. His is Giambellino. Giambellino. Just as one word. This is Papa Bellini, and here's Giovanni. As you can see, he's adopted a lot of the things from his father, although it has a more clarity. There is a greater sense of chiaroscuro, of light and dark, especially visible in the garments of the Virgin. But by the 80s and 90s, he's doing a painting like this in oil paint. Then you can see for example, in here the tempera, here the oil paint, the much deeper, richer darks that are available. And also, and this is very hard to see in these slides, but the transparent, translucent quality. Because as you're glazing, these are transparent glazes that lie one over another over the underpainting. So the underpainting is still visible. So you can mix colors. Let's say you have a yellow underpainting and you glaze blue over it, it will look green, right? So you can mix colors by glazing over them, and you can also create these wonderful transitions like this that are just impossible to do in tempera with the dry brush technique. Now this is a Bellini, very late Bellini, and it's in the Gardner Museum in Boston, and it's Christ carrying the cross. And here's a little close-up of it. I did a copy of it last year. Then here is the first stage. So you can see that the underpainting is all the drawing, all the proportions, all the light and dark are all figured out in monochrome in the underpainting. And this is done, I did it in acrylic, but would have been done in tempera, so that that dry brush technique would have worked. Now, once that's down, then you can varnish it. And then it's a very, very forgiving sort of technique, because no matter how much you mess up in the subsequent layer upon layer of glazes, you can get out your turpentine and a rag and you can wipe it down. You can always get back to this underpainting if it's really been sealed well under a good coat of varnish. And I, of course, cheated because I used acrylic varnish and so forth. And what I did is I just scanned the painting in on a scanner, and they didn't all come out so well. But then you start adding the colors, but letting some of the underpainting shine through. Here, only the cross itself is the original yellow ochre of the painting. And you can see, as I put in this red glaze, it's made the face redder than it originally will be, eventually will be, but especially that red picks up on the lips. Then you scumble layers of light, working up toward the highlights, and on the other hand, you add darknesses in certain areas to bring the darkness in. Now, each of these layers, when you get a layer done like this, right? Then what you do is you seal it with a coat of varnish. And that will prevent, that's like pushing save on your computer. Because once you've varnished it, then you can glaze, and if you mess up, you can carefully wipe it away and get back to that varnish. And everything that's under the varnish is preserved. So each step along the way, you seal it off with a coat of varnish, which is really good for someone of limited skills like me, because I mess up a lot. And it's really nice to have this very kind of forgiving medium. Later painters like the Impressionists who paint alla prima, they paint all at once. If you mess up, that's it. But with this, a very, very forgiving medium. Okay, and okay, so Now, when you look at him, you find these luscious, luscious colors that Bellini was using already by the 80s and the 90s, the 1480s and 90s, of course. And this is what's called a sacra conversazione, or a sacred conversation, because it brings together various different figures from different time periods, as if they're all in heaven having kind of a discussion. And this is a gospel writer, and he holds his gospel right here. I'm not sure if it's Matthew or Luke, but these are the two that deal with the infancy of Jesus, and the other two deal with only the adult Jesus. And this is a prophet. I'm not sure who, perhaps Isaiah, who is, according to Christians, prophesied of the birth of Jesus. And it takes place in this very nice Renaissance, enclosure. Now, it's really interesting that this part here is actually carved stone in that Petrus Serena, that gray stone that the Renaissance, that Brunelleschi and other Renaissance artists like so much. And then what he does is he makes an exact duplicate in the painting and connects them by these arches. So you feel like you're, peering beyond the sculpted reality into this illusory realm, where the saints and angels and so forth cavort with one another. Look at the luminous color. The blue of this garment, it just absolutely sings. It's musical. He is a master of color. And the wonderful way that the light and shade is handled as well. Here's another altarpiece, and here also I brought in the frame, because the frame is this is sculpted frame is related to the painting behind it. For example, here he's creating this this illusory thing that seems to just continue this decorative scheme from here right back into that dome and back on to reality. And one of the interesting things here is he doesn't use any gold leaf. It used to be in the Middle Ages and earlier Renaissance that they would take actual sheets of gold, very, very thin, like a tissue paper thin, and glue them onto the panel. And here he affects the look of shimmering, shining gold, but it's all just done with his yellows and his whites and his browns, very skillfully shaded. Look at that. Look at the shine he gets here. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And he means it as a tour de force. He means it as a thing of like, look what I can do. Look at how I can fool the eye. And some of them, this guy actually looks rather at us rather judgmentally in some ways. One of my favorite paintings is in the Frick, and it's St. Francis in Ecstasy, or St. Francis in the Desert. It has a couple of different titles. It's from the 1480s, so it's one of really the beginning of his experimentation with oil paint, and I think he reaches a very high level in this painting. If you look at it very closely, you can really see the different levels that are going on here, and it appears that a bright orange yellow is the underpainting. So the whole thing is painted that yellow orange, not the ochre that I showed in the more timid copy that I made. But this is a more brilliant orange yellow that we see, for example, here, or we see in some of these buildings. In the background is the little hilltop town of Assisi in central Italy, where St. Francis is from. And St. Francis here emerges from his cave retreat at dawn, just before the sun comes up, and he views it as if it's a miracle. And the loving display of nature in here is very Franciscan. It really reminds us of St. Francis talking to the birds, and he's kind of the patron saint of animals, as well as the patron saint of Italy, actually, very inspiring, even to non-Christians. They like that. Now, stop that. I'm having, my kitten is giving me trouble here. So what we have here is this orange, and then layer upon layer of blues and cool grays and cool browns. but it gives the effect of the orange shines through all those transparent layers like a jewel reflecting and refracting light. And it just has an absolutely amazing quality of almost that the light seems to be coming from behind the canvas and be emerging as the sun does. And then Francesco himself is shown, in amazement. And I wanted to point out too, well, and there are all sorts of symbolism. For example, the grape vines here have to do with the communion wine. The skull on his little reading table reminds him of death. His wooden shoes taken off, remind us that this is a holy place. He's barefoot, and that's one of his characteristics. Is he walked around barefoot like a pauper, a decalced friar. Okay, so this shows him, and an interesting thing is that during the Renaissance, divine grace was represented by idealization of form, so that Christ and Mary and various saints, they don't look like real people. They've been idealized. They look like, especially like ancient Greco-Roman gods, like Adonis and Venus and so forth. But not here. Here he's a homely saint, a balding pate, a crooked nose, and this goes along with this search for reality, because Bellini is trying to kind of show us the incredible breadth and depth of these colors and of this new jewel-like technique. And this is just an absolutely radiant painting, and you must see it in the Frick. It's really one of my favorites. And I published a short piece on this recently, and I guess maybe I could place it on my website, or perhaps even at the library site. Okay, so let's continue now. To compare it a little bit to the contemporaneous Tempra painting, because remember, Botticelli is doing his painting at the same time in Tempra, and this is this Adoration of the Magi that we looked at last week in Tempra. What I want to show here is how you work in Tempra, because the darknesses are for example, this red robe. It's kind of an earth red, terra rosa, and so it's a little earthy. It's not a bright vermilion or anything like that. And the pure color is represented in the shadows here. So he would have painted the whole of this red area with this darker shaded area. Then, and we know this, there's a piece by Cennino Cennini where he kind of gives you a lot of recipes and stuff. It's called the Artist's Handbook, Craftsman's Handbook, from the early 1400s. And he tells how to grind paint and how to do different things. And then he says, if you're representing, the shadow should be represented by the pure pigment. Then you mix that 50-50 with white, and that's your next highest value. So that would be these middle tones in here and in here, right? But as he applied these middle tones, he would leave the dark tones behind. And then there'd be a highlight. You see, here's a lighter thing, which would also be scumbled on with a dry brush, okay? So what we end up is the deepest shade is actually the purest color. So we see that in here too. This pure cerulean blue is then diluted with white or mixed with white to give these lighter and lighter shades. Okay, now, if we compare this, just take a good look at that red robe and its shadows and compare that to what we see in the Bellini that we had just seen a minute ago of this Sacra Conversazione. And here's Isaiah or Moses, I forget which Old Testament prophet, which Hebrew prophet it is. But here you can see that Bellini begins there's a yellow underpainting. You can see that sort of glowing through at parts. But then he lays in a transparent middle red and then works and wipes away with a rag part of it to reveal the more orange, lighter underpainting. And then after he seals that with a coat of varnish, then he goes back in with browns and begins to work down to the darknesses. So he begins with the middle tone, glazes up toward the lights, or stumbles up toward the lighter tones, and glazes down to the darker tones from that middle tone. And that gives it a kind of breadth that the earlier stuff doesn't have. It doesn't have that darkness. It doesn't have that because the pure tone is the dark tone. Here, the pure tone is the middle tone. Then it gives it a much more resonant and much more luminous. And you can even see it in this slide. And in the original, you can really see it because it really sings and it really seems to glow. And Leonardo da Vinci does it even better than Bellini. This is an early Leonardo, which we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks, of the Annunciation. I just want to point out, you know, his use here. Again, he like Bellini, begins with a middle red and glazes down to the darks and stumbles up to the lights, separating. Every time he gets something worthwhile keeping, he seals it under a coat of varnish. And so we have layers of paint and varnish and paint and varnish and paint and varnish and paint and varnish. One of the things is that we have to remember is that each successive layer of oil must be oilier than the layer underneath it. And so some of these, there may be 30 different layers on the painting at the very end. And so there are glazes upon glazes, and as you get farther on, you have to increase the oiliness of it. So it's called fat overlay. Okay. Wow. Okay. It's very easy to get caught up in doing this. I started actually making my cat is knocking everything in the floor, so I don't know, you know, what to do. If you hear banging in the background, it's him destroying the kitchen. But I want to point out here, remember we had said that on the right-hand side is a self-portrait of Botticelli, and the other side is the patron, the person who paid for it, and that's Lorenzo de' Medici's brother, Giuliano de' Medici. And here he is shown dressed in contemporary costume as a rich banker. Here's another portrait that Botticelli does of this mentor, and he has quite an underbite and quite a schnoz. So he's not idealized, but in portraits you don't want to. You want to really show how the guy looked. This is a posthumous portrait because Giuliano de' Medici was actually murdered in the cathedral in Florence on Easter Sunday during an insurrection against the rule of the Medici, which was never direct. It was always behind the scenes, but they were bankrolling everything. And they had a lot of influence in the nominally democratic kind of government that's going on there. Here, he shows this bird, a quail, which is a sign of mourning, and also that window in the background opening shows the soul's escape from the body. His brother, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was actually locked in the sacristy of the cathedral so that he could be protected until the insurrection could be put down. But the brother was actually murdered on Easter Sunday in the cathedral. So this is very exciting stories that we have it. Now, the interesting thing is in the early 90s, the Medici Bank went bankrupt. The largest bank in Europe went bankrupt, and the Medici were run from the city, and a new republic was declared at that time. Okay, so, and then who captured power was this fiery preacher Savannah, who was a Dominican monk who lived there at the San Marco monastery in Florence that we had looked at earlier, where Fra Angelico painted every cell in the monastery. And so he kind of took over and became the de facto ruler. And his interpretation of the Medici bankruptcy was that they had all these pagan ideas. They were reviving Plato and Aristotle. They were showing nudes. They were showing ancient gods and goddesses like Venus and Zeus and these mythological things. And God was very upset of these developments of the Renaissance, and his anger was shown by destroying the Medici Bank. What they didn't understand is because capitalism was so new, they didn't realize that capitalism goes through periods of boom and bust. And it happens. It happened in the 20th century. It's happened in my lifetime, right? The boom times and the bust times. And what they didn't understand was this was not the end. This was a law. And it certainly was an important law, and the Medici had to leave the city. And then the city became under the grip of this fanatical preacher. And even Botticelli and Savonarola instituted what he called bonfires of the vanities. He said, bring them to the square out there in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, kind of the center of town where Michelangelo's David is now. This was before that. And he organized bonfires in the piazza there, in the plaza, and said, bring your pagan mythologies, bring your naked statues, bring your realistic Renaissance paintings of gods and goddesses and buxom nudes and all that sort of stuff. Is all sinful. We have to repent, or we'll never recover economically. And so he organized these huge bonfires. And even Botticelli became convinced of the correctness of Savonarola, and he repented and destroyed some of his own work. Thank God Botticelli was so popular of an artist and had sold so many of his works, there wasn't much of it for him to get his hands on. But during the 90s, his work does change and takes on a very much less hopeful tone than what we had seen last week in The Birth of Venus. Here is this very despairing moment of the Pietà, which means pity, and Jesus, having been crucified, is taken down from the cross and placed in the arms of his mother. Behind him is the tomb that he's going to be buried in, and she's fainted away, as you can see. A Tempra painting again. Jesus, however, is shown incredibly idealized. He looks like, you know, an Olympic swimmer. He doesn't have a beard. He's just this beautiful youth. And again, Botticelli, this wonderful dry brush stuff that he does here with these transparent garments. He's really a master at doing that. So paintings like this have this melancholy and depressing and tragic, dystopic kind of quality to them. Even in a painting like this, and this is an amusing one in some ways, it's a nativity that takes the stable is sort of also a cave, and the angels dance around on top. But what I want to point out are on the bottom, angels are wrestling with pagan philosophers. So here I think we have Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and these little ribbons tell who they are, and they're wrestling with angels. So the conflict between these ancient pagan philosophers that were so important to the development of Renaissance theory and mixed in with Christianity are now seen as opposing things, and that it's the kind of thing of our time. This is a very mysterious, strange old painting. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we're getting to the end of our time, but this is a small painting that's in the collection of Harvard in the Fogg Museum. It's small and it's very damaged. You can see here, this is all a paint that has chipped off. But you can see that Christ is crucified, and it's an angel holding, I don't know, a fox or an ermine. We're not sure what that means. Black smoke seems to come out of the cross. In the background is not Jerusalem, but is Florence. There's the Duomo, there's Giotto's tower. It's nestled in there. So he's being crucified on the hills outside of Florence. And up in the corner we have a Dominican. That is a Dominican monk like Savonarola. And so this probably had some sort of dire dystopian meaning at this time. But Savonarola went too far, because he began to criticize everything, not only art, not only the government of Florence. Oh, and by the way, this is what Jerry Falwell or some of these TV ministers wouldn't give for this kind of an effect. One time when Savonarola was preaching in the Duomo, there was a thunderstorm, and the lightning hit the Duomo. I mean, it hit the very top of the dome, and it shook the whole church. And he worked it right into the sermon. He said, "Behold the sword of the Lord." So, you know, what wouldn't some TV minister give for that kind of special effects? It's really incredible. So he was kind of mesmerized the whole town and got them to destroy their own things and kind of turned their back on the Renaissance, which they began to see as thoroughly corrupt and pagan, and that we needed to return to this, medieval sort of more austere kind of Christianity. But he went too far, and he criticized the Pope. And this Pope was not, this was a very gangsterous Pope, Rogerio Borgia, Alexander VI. His bastard son, who he called Cesare, called Caesar, tells him, conquer all of Italy and bring it under my rule. His daughter is Lucretia Borgia, who poisons people. She poisoned in a ring. Wonderful stories of this incredibly corrupt Pope. You know, now we think of the Pope as this kindly old man, and you know, in Italy, but at this time it was, you know, Godfather kind of gangsterism, and this was a particularly corrupt Pope, and he started criticizing him for his illegitimate children and his lavish lifestyle and so forth. And so the Pope ended that, and they hung Savonarola and then burned his body in the square right outside of the Piazza Vecchio, which is right here, the old Palazzo di Vecchio. Okay, so this is the ignominious end of Savonarola. But the good thing was they were able to recover from this and reestablish a semblance of a democracy, or a rule by a council in the direction of democracy. They used as their ideal Plato's republic, and they wanted to create that kind of thing. But actually, you might think that this is the end, right? The Renaissance had its day, it ran its course, capitalism collapsed, and even Savonarola gets his comeuppance, but this is not the end. In fact, it's really only the beginning, because the Medici will come back, they will restore themselves, they will return to Florence, and Florence will get to higher and higher levels of the Renaissance in the work of Leonardo and Michelangelo, Andrea del Sarto, and other people of the High Renaissance, which we'll be going to be talking about in subsequent lectures. Okay, well, I guess that's about the end of what I have for you today. I wanted to give you my website. You might want to take a look at that at some point. It's just DennisRaverty.com, and you can see some of my publications there and some other things like that. And so I guess I can actually, yeah, here is my website. So you might want to take a look at the events, upcoming things, popular talks on art, for your church and synagogue and all that sort of stuff. So that's the end of my advertisement. So let me take myself out of screen sharing, I guess, and